Welcome back, students. Tonight we will continue our study of ecology by discussing the specific ways in which species interact within biological communities. Let's get started. We left off last time by talking about an organism's niche and how species must have their own niche within a community in which they coexist with other species. This point highlights an essential fact in ecology, which is that populations do not live in isolation. Instead, they constantly interact with and depend on each other. In today's lecture, we're going to identify three categories of interactions between species within an ecosystem. These interactions are feeding relationships, symbiotic relationships, and competitive relationships. We will discuss each category in detail on the following slides. We'll begin with feeding relationships that exist between organisms and their environments. In any community, we are able to categorize species based on the way that they obtain energy from their environment. The most basic of these methods of obtaining energy is used by autotrophs, which are organisms that use energy from either sunlight or from inorganic chemicals to produce food for themselves and for other organisms. Autotrophs are also referred to as producers. If an autotroph uses energy from sunlight, it will do so through the chemical process called photosynthesis, with the prefix photo here meaning light. If the organism obtains its energy through using inorganic chemicals, it will do so through the process called chemosynthesis, with the term chemo here referring to chemicals. Types of organisms that are autotrophs include plants, as well as some forms of algae and bacteria. Now, autotrophs are really incredible organisms because they can do something that, if it weren't rock-solid science, would almost seem like magic. What they can do is they can take inorganic carbon molecules from the environment, like the carbon dioxide shown over here in the air. And they can turn those inorganic carbon molecules into organic carbon molecules that make up living cells and that are used for food. In other words, autotrophs can turn air into food. Just let that incredibility and awesomeness sink in for a second. Because of this unique ability to make their own food from their surroundings, autotrophs form the base of the food chain. And thus, the stability of autotrophs is vital to every ecosystem. The second method of obtaining energy from the environment is used by heterotrophs, which are organisms that obtain both energy and biological nutrients from eating other organisms. Heterotrophs are also sometimes referred to as consumers. Organisms that are heterotrophs include all animal species, as well as some bacteria and even a small number of plants. We can further classify heterotrophs based on what types of organisms they eat. So, for example, some organisms consume only producers, like plants and algae. These organisms that consume only producers are called herbivores. And you see two examples here, the caterpillar and the rabbit, which both feed exclusively on plants. Like autotrophs, herbivores play a vital role in the food chain, as they form a necessary link between producers and consumers in the food chain. In contrast to herbivores, if a heterotroph consumes only animals, that heterotroph is called a carnivore. The lioness below eats only other animals, so she would be considered a carnivore. Many, but not all, carnivores are classified as predators, which means that they actively hunt their prey. A third category of heterotrophs are the omnivores. Omnivores consume both plants and animals. Bears, pigs, and humans are classic examples of omnivores because these species will eat a wide variety of organisms to obtain their energy. The final method by which organisms obtain energy from their environment is used by the decomposers, which are a subcategory of heterotrophs that feed specifically on dead organisms or on the waste products of other organisms. Decomposers are found at the end of the food chain, and they help reverse the work done by autotrophs by transforming organic molecules that make up organisms back into the inorganic nutrients from which they came. These inorganic nutrients are then returned to the environment and made available to producers. Like heterotrophs, decomposers can be categorized by the specific way in which they feed. So, for example, scavengers are organisms that feed on soft tissues of dead animals, thereby starting the decomposition process. The vulture in the bottom left, picking the meat off this dead carcass, is a classic example of a scavenger. Next, detritivores consume things such as dead leaves, animal feces, and other types of organic debris that collect on soils or at the bottoms of bodies of water. Some examples of detritivores include earthworms, slugs, sea cucumbers, dung beetles, and other organisms like these. Finally, the saprotrophs are organisms that don't eat by ingesting other organisms, but instead they secrete enzymes out into the environment around them, and those enzymes will then break down the food outside of the organism, and then the organism can simply absorb the nutrients into its cells. Saprotrophs include things like fungi, which are shown here, as well as some species of protists and bacteria. Okay, now that we've covered feeding relationships, let's talk about some non-feeding relationships between organisms. The first one, symbiosis, is the name for a close, long-term association between organisms of different species. If we break this term down into its parts, we see that sym means together and bio means life. So, in other words, symbiosis is a relationship in which different species of organisms live together. When organisms live symbiotically, their interactions may be beneficial, harmful, or neutral. Let's look below at some different types of symbiotic relationships. First, if both organisms benefit from the symbiotic relationship, that relationship is called mutualism. In the picture, the rhino benefits as the bird removes pests from its back, and the bird benefits by having an easy access to a nutritious food source. Mutualism, therefore, is a win-win situation. A second type of symbiosis is called commensalism. This is when one species benefits and the other species is simply unaffected. In the example, we have two species of plants. The orchid plant is growing on a separate species of tree. The tree is not affected by the presence of the orchid, but the orchid benefits by living on the tree because it is able to access more sunlight by living on the tree than it would by simply growing out of the ground. Finally, a third symbiotic relationship is parasitism. This is a relationship in which one organism benefits while the other organism is harmed. In the example, the fungus infects the caterpillar extracting nutrients from the caterpillar at the expense of the caterpillar's health. The final non-feeding relationship that exists between organisms is competition. Competition occurs between organisms that strive for the same resources in the same place. The resources that organisms might compete for include things such as food, water, space, or mates. Competitive relationships can be categorized in two ways. First, competition can be intraspecific, or occurring between members of the same species. An example of intraspecific competition is shown in the bottom left corner. These rams belong to the same species, and they are competing over mates. Competition can also be interspecific, or occurring between members of different species. We see this in the bottom middle pictures, where both the bear and the eagles are competing for the same food source, which is the salmon. We could also see this in the right-hand picture, in which two different species of barnacles are competing for important space on the rock within the tidal zone. Unlike symbiotic relationships that we just looked at, in competitive relationships, both organisms are negatively affected. All right, everyone, thanks for your patience with all these new terms. We are done for tonight, and I'm looking forward to practicing these new concepts with you tomorrow. See you then.